David Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for holding this markup as we consider multiple pieces of legislation that would reaffirm both our willingness to engage constructively with partners across 3 African nations and our unyielding commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. I particularly want to thank Congressman Malinowski for leading this effort with respect to HR 6600 and also for his lifetime of work in promoting democracy and human rights around the world. And also thank Young Kim for being the Republican lead on this important legislation. With HR 6600, we can give U.S. diplomats an array of tools that would compel the Ethiopian government and regional stakeholders from across Ethiopia to come to the table and bring an end to the senseless violence that threatens the long-term viability of peace and stability. For months, warfare in Tigray and across Ethiopia, as well as cross-border skirmishes in Eritrea, has really stirred the conscience of the world. In the face of extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, and political detentions, the United States must do all it can to encourage an end to the hostilities, to partner with those in Ethiopia working to bring about a lasting peace through democracy and the rule of law. I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this critical legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlemen yields, and I will now recess until we have completed the 2 votes that are on the floor.
Citizens find a diplomat.
Where I left off, I think I will recognize Representative Andy Levin of Michigan, the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this bill and its efforts to promote sustainable peace and security in Ethiopia. I've watched in horror as conflict erupted and caused untold civilian suffering in Tigray and other regions of Ethiopia. We know that multiple parties to this conflict have been incredibly implicated in human rights violations, and that more intense work to bring peace to Ethiopia is desperately needed. This bill aims to support peace by ensuring that the United States can make every effort possible to find a diplomatic resolution and to support accountability mechanisms for the horrific human rights abuses that have been perpetrated by all sides. Finding a path forward to peace and stability matters not only to those in Ethiopia. My heart breaks for my constituents in Michigan and others I've met around the country who are working tirelessly to raise awareness in the United States about what's happening to their families and their friends in their homeland. This bill is an important way for Congress to show that we're listening, and more importantly, that we're acting to bring peace to Ethiopia. I'm grateful to Congressman Malinowski, Chair Meeks, Ranking Member McCall, and Congresswoman Young Kim for their collaboration here, and I'm proud to support this legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Levin used back his time. Do any of the members wish to speak on this measure?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Hearing no further requests, we'll move to amendments. For what purposes? Oh, Mr. Sherman has just said he had a amendment at the desk. The clerk shall distribute the amendment to your staff virtually. Let's pause briefly, give all members enough time to review the amendment.
This amendment number 7.
Amendment number 70. Has everyone received a copy of the amendment? Clerk will please report the amendment.
Sherman Amendment number 70 to HR 6600, page 12, line 8.
Without objection, the further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. A point of order reserved. Representative from California, Mr. Sherman, is now recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you. I think the greatest problem in Ethiopia is the use of starvation as a weapon and the blockade of food aid. But there's another problem as well that is not mentioned in the base text, or at least not mentioned sufficiently. And the purpose of my amendment is to deal with the problem. And that is the problem that since President Abiy declared a national emergency back in November, tens of thousands of ordinary Ethiopian civilians of Tigrayan ethnicity have become the victims of an inexcusable, unconscionable campaign of mass ethnic motivated detentions, where they have been held in conditions that the U.S. State Department has termed unlivable. Tigrayans have reportedly been targeted by police based on a mixture of factors that hint at their ethnic origin. Their surnames, details listed on their identification cards and driver's licenses, even their accents. The mass detentions have also resulted in the seizure of American citizens, UN staff members, and UN subcontractors. According to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, these developments are all more disturbing given that most of those detained are reported to be people of Tigrayan origin. Detention conditions are generally reported to be poor, with many detainees held in overcrowded police stations in violation of international human rights standards. And there are worrying reports that many of those detained have not been informed of the reasons for their detention, nor have they been brought before a court of law or other tribunal to review the reasons for their detention, and they've not been formally charged. That is because these tens of thousands of people are being arrested, detained, and in some cases disappeared just because of their Tigrayan ethnicity. Tigrayan detainees include women, children, the elderly. They're held in overcrowded facilities, often without food, water, medical care, or even access to restrooms. There are reports of systemic starvations and beatings. According to the Human Rights Watch, Ethiopian authorities have also arbitrarily detained, mistreated, and forcibly disappeared thousands of ethnic Tigrayans who were deported to Addis Ababa recently from Saudi Arabia following a repatriation agreement. Due to the barring of human rights observers from these detention facilities, conditions could likely be much worse than what we've observed when outside observers have been able to gain access. Equally egregious are the mass detentions of Tigrayans by the Amhara security forces in Western Tigray, which the State Department has described as gravely concerning. The detention of tens of thousands of civilians on an ethnic basis without charges in life-threatening conditions is a human rights violation that demands a U.S. response. That is why U.S. Mission Geneva Charged Affairs Benjamin Moling exhibited when he said in December, "We condemn the use of starvation as a weapon of war, which the Ethiopian government has done by blockading humanitarian access and detaining thousands of ethnic Tigrayans under life-threatening conditions." As I pointed out, some of those detained are U.S. citizens. My amendment ensures that when we look to suspend sanctions, and I hope that there's progress that would justify that, it's conditioned not only on a ceasefire, but also the release of these tens of thousands of people imprisoned only on the basis of their ethnicity. And certainly, as someone of Jewish heritage, nothing, I can't really express just how horrifying it is that police would roam a city, roam a countryside, and arrest people, take them into custody solely based on their ethnicity. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment that I yield back.
Representative Sherman yields back. I support this amendment because the United States should continue to encourage productive and meaningful steps toward the negotiating table. Along with a ceasefire and an inclusive political dialogue, the release of prisoners detained during this war, whether ethnic or political affiliation, is a critical part of working toward peace and reconciliation in good faith. And for those reasons, I urge my colleagues to do the same. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Representative Karen Bass of California, Chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights.
And-
Recognized for 5 minutes.
And Mr. Chair, I heard you asked about the amendment. My time was in reference to the general bills. Is that okay, or would you like for me to wait?
You can wait.
Okay.
You can do that. Let's do it now. General bill.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak on several important measures. I would like to note that a number of measures related to Africa, and I'm encouraged to see my colleagues address these significant issues across the continent as I continue to push for peace in the Anglophone region of Cameroon. I also seek committee endorsement of legislation on trafficking victims across the globe. I anticipate the usual bipartisan support for Africa-related legislation, as well as solicit your support to combat global human trafficking. Today, I bring HRES 895, strongly condemning ongoing violence and human rights abuses stemming from Cameroon's Anglophone crisis to the committee today for your consideration. This resolution condemns the continued violence taking place in the region by the government of Cameroon, and that the first Liberian settlers were from the United States. As the bicentennial of the arrival of the first free Black Americans to Liberia approaches, I note the day does not go unnoticed, and I applaud the efforts the country has taken to uphold the tenets of democracy, and I wish I could join the chairman in the trip that he'll be taking to Liberia very soon. I also support the work of my fellow Congress members to promote and protect democratic principles and human rights in Burma, Ethiopia, specifically in the case in Rwanda, and Christians in China. The collective nature of these measures and that of Cameroon and trafficking demonstrates the importance of our work to further promote democratic tenets and human rights around the world. People are suffering and will continue to do so until we make the changes necessary to promote and protect all of humanity equally. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Young lady, yield back the balance of her time. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Hearing no further request to speak. The question is on the Sherman Amendment designated number 7. We're going to take a vote by voice. All members unmute your microphones.
Especially those who are more likely to get seriously sick, like babies.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what
Chairman,
what purposes does Representative from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, seek recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk to distribute the amendment to your staff virtually, and let's pause briefly to give all members enough time to review this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, is this amendment number 80?
This is amendment number 83. Did everyone receive a copy of the amendment? The clerk will please report the amendment.
Omar amendment number 83 to HR 6600.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. A point of order reserved. The representative, Ms. Omar from Minnesota, is now recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, I want to thank Mr. Malinowski for introducing the underlying bill. As I have spoken to this amendment earlier, we have to do everything that we can to protect the lives of people, and that includes providing humanitarian support and fighting for access, but it also includes resettlement support. I think it's really important for us to do everything that we can as we address the conflict in Ethiopia for everyone that's being displaced. I would also like to take this time to speak a little bit to the other amendments that we are considering, other resolutions that we are considering today. I wanted to thank Chairman Castro for the legislation that he brought. I just want to make sure that we are clear that the crimes that Mr. Bagina has been accused of by the Rwandan government are serious. While I acknowledge the reports of serious concerns related to the process leading to his arrest and trial, this man is credibly accused of terrorism, tried, and convicted. Although I understand the desire to release him on humanitarian grounds, I cannot support it. There is nothing stopping him from continuing to support violence and terrorism if he is released. I recognize that this is deeply complicated issue, but I sincerely do appreciate Mr. Castro's advocacy on behalf of his constituent, but I reluctantly oppose this resolution. I also want to thank Chairwoman Bass for her leadership with the resolution on the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. I do think this committee needs to be clear about something. We trained and funded some of the units and individuals that are alleged to have participated in the atrocities in the Anglophone region. I don't think this should pass without comment as we discuss this crisis. For me, Cameroon is a case study in what happens when our only concern in a country is militarized approach to counterterrorism. When Boko Haram arrived in Cameroon, we poured millions of dollars into security assistance, some of which might well have been used to commit the massacre that we are all voting to condemn today. So when we think about counterterrorism, especially in West Africa, I believe we should understand Cameroon as a cautionary tale. We should really reconsider our security first approach because this is what happens. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yields back. I support this amendment because it will ensure the State Department has the data necessary to determine what resources are required to provide additional protection for those who have become refugees or internally displaced by the civil war in Ethiopia. As we have seen in other regions, having a firm understanding of these needs will ensure that the United States is in the best position to plan and act accordingly. Thus, I urge my colleagues to do the same. Is there any further debate on the amendment? Hearing no further requests to speak. The question is on Omar Amendment number 83. We're going to take a vote by voice. All members, please unmute your microphone. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Are there any other amendments? Hearing no other amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Perry, number 513.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order. What's the point of order?
Mr. Chairman, the Perry Amendment 513 is about inflation. The amendment is not tied to foreign policy, but tied to a domestic component. It's not germane to the issue before the committee.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if this is the appropriate time to give remarks to Mr. Cicilline, but
Well, let me
Happy to
have
do so,
the clerk
please.
distribute the amendment first. All members see the amendment. Clerk shall read the amendment.
Carry amendment number 513 to HR 6600. At the end of.
Without objection. First reading of the resolution is dispensed with. What? Point of order. Mr. Mass?
recognized, Chairman.
Yes, you're recognized.
Okay, thank you. This amendment, no funds may be used to carry out the strategy described in the subsection A of section 3 until the U.S. inflation rate for a given calendar year is 2% or lower. Mr. Chairman, it is easy to appreciate the good intentions undergirding this bill. What we have witnessed out of Ethiopia has been nothing short of horrific, and any effort to mitigate that crisis in the country should be very carefully examined. And while this bill goes a long way to upholding perpetrators of violence accountable, I would first like to generally address a few concerns with the legislation. First, there's an overarching concern that the bill will end up spending money that we simply do not have, while inflation is at a rate not seen in over 40 years. Second, it is difficult to understand how extending international financed institution loans and technical assistance to the governments of Ethiopia and Eritrea would meaningfully assist human rights or promote peace, as both governments have been doing an extremely poor job of both of those things. Having discussed my general issues with the bill, I would like to focus on the aspect that may well have the most direct impact on the American taxpayer, Section 3, which calls for an interagency strategy to address several aspects of the Tigray War. This strategy aims to advance the diplomatic engagement, address humanitarian concerns, hold those guilty of crimes against humanity accountable, combat disinformation, there's that word again, and offer psychosocial rehabilitation for those who need it. It also includes a provision to evacuate American citizens out of the country. I would ask, has the State Department not learned its lesson from sitting around and doing nothing in previous states, like what happened in Afghanistan? Are they waiting for a bill from Congress in order to take action on that planning? Why do they need that authorization from Congress? It takes several months to sign into law before they would start putting together a contingency plan. Obviously, that would be ridiculous. If the State Department hasn't already been working to remove our people from Ethiopia, people need to be fired very clearly, and the Secretary would need to be impeached for such a dereliction. If this provision is necessary, it needs to be asked, is our State Department really doing its job? Now, understanding the good intentions undergirding this bill, this amendment simply makes one small recommendation: that we forestall the implementation of the strategy described in Section 3 until the U.S. inflation rate falls to 2% or lower. The Federal Open Market Committee, according to their website, judges that inflation of 2% over the longer run, as measured by the annual change in the price index for personnel consumption expenditures, is most consistent with the Federal Reserve's mandate for maximum employment and price stability. Before we place an additional spending burden on the shoulders of American public, we ought to make sure that we are in a position where the value of their hard-earned income isn't compromised as a result. That should not be considered an excessively burdensome request, but it will undoubtedly endure pushback from some who believe it's okay to make it harder for Americans to buy food in order to fund a strategy that should already be in motion. They have the authorities, they have the staff, they certainly have the funding. We all understand the urge to help those in need, but that needs to be reconciled with our ability to do so. We owe it to the American people to prioritize what we spend money on as to defray the costs of inflation in our own country. Our efforts mean something for a family who has seen 3 years worth of wages gains wiped away. Our efforts mean something for workers who have had to take on a second job to keep up with the rising costs of groceries, gas, and rent. Our efforts certainly mean a lot to those families who paid $3,500 more last year to consume the same level of goods and services as they did in 2020 or 2019. This amendment forestalls additional spending until our economy is in the best possible shape to help others. To put the American people first, I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair is prepared to rule. Perry Amendment 513 ties the conditional effectiveness needs to be related to the underlying measure. The underlying measure here is limited to matters abroad, while the condition is domestic looking and thus unrelated. The amendment is not in order. Pursuant to notice, for purpose of this markup, I now call up H-Res 892.
There are more amendments at the desk, Mr. Chair.
Oh, there's more amendments.